Good evening, everybody. My name's Sammy. I'm head of adult programs here at the Nantucket Athenaeum with my colleague, Sean Allen. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. We're really excited. Just a few quick notes before we get started. If everyone could please just take a moment and silence their cell phones, that would be super. Tonight's author talk will feature journalist, author, screenwriter, and film producer Shannon A. Mullen and her book, In Other Words, Leadership. And will be moderated by Emmy Award winning actor, director, writer, and producer John Shea. Copies of the book will be on sale after the talk. Thank you.
Beverly, thank you everyone for coming on the most beautiful day of the year so far in 2023. In my humble opinion, particularly after a week of rain. Believe it or not, this is Shannon. I'm John. I know you. I'm thirsty already, just climbing the stairs. So I'm going to pour us each a glass of water and learn how to pour.
Thank you very much.
There you are.
I heard that Frederick Douglass spoke on this stage. And Ralph Waldo Emerson. And,
Ralph Waldo Emerson.
and Thoreau as well.
And
illustrious company.
it was. I don't have a mic here. I can put it on.
Yep.
And now you can hear me. Everything I said before is not important, except the thank yous to Sammy and Sean and the library, the Athenaeum,
Yes.
and the Great Hall. And it's so great that you're here. You make the Great Hall great. It's my great pleasure. And, you know, I'm going to go back to my backpack. This is so completely spontaneous working with you. Shannon and I met last night, strangely enough. We have mutual friends in Maine. And they wrote to me and they said, oh my God, we have this great friend. She's written this amazing book about this great story. And you have to help her. You have to show up. I know you'd rather be on the beach or something, but, you know, she's written a book. Who here, if you give me a show of hands, has written a book?
All right. Wow.
Sure.
Okay.
Congratulations. Then you know, you're a survivor. So it's amazing to write a book. And it's amazing to publish a book. A lot of people write books where they don't get it published. And then it's amazing to write a book that gets published that's good. I think it's really hard. So, because I have so many friends who are writers, Nantucket is famous for writers. We could look in these bookshelves and downstairs, and we'd find lots of people probably who have been inspired by Nantucket, but you were inspired by Maine. I want to read a couple of things that Sammy didn't read in her introduction just about Shannon, and they may spark questions for you later. So she grew up in the White Mountains, in the Lakes region of New Hampshire. You've probably been there. You know, it's spectacular. I was born there too, by the way. We have that in common. In North Conway. Where were you born?
Concord.
In Concord.
Concord Hospital.
Okay. Okay. I was born in Mount Cranmore at the ski resort because there was no hospital there in those days. We're talking about the 1850s or anyway. My father drove in a snowstorm from Freiburg Academy, like in Maine, and it was the closest hospital was there, and the skiers hospital at the foot of the ski mobile, and they kicked the poor skiers out, and my mother gave birth to me in a snowstorm. Anyway, thus. And how about you? Did you have any drama in your?
No, there was a rainbow, my mom said, and when I was born.
Well, and you were the pot of gold.
Nothing to do with me.
You were the pot of gold at the end of it. All right.
Not yet.
I don't know. She studied pre-veterinary medicine at UNH. So, but you were inspired by James Herriot's books?
I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, but what I really messed that message up. I wanted to be a storyteller and I loved his stories. So I went pretty far down that road before I realized that mistake. and course corrected into journalism.
While you were at UNH?
No, I finished. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in pre-veterinary medicine. I got really good grades because I was told you had to get into veterinary school. And then I took a year and worked on a boat and started working for a newspaper in Newport, Rhode Island. And the whole staff quit one day. And so I wrote the whole paper and thought, well, I like this, and applied to graduate school and went to Boston University for a master's degree in broadcast journalism, and then have spent the last 20 years working for national shows on public radio. So I figured it out pretty quickly once I figured it out.
National shows that include Marketplace. We all love Marketplace and listen to it as we drive around the island or wherever we are in the world. Morning Edition, awesome. And All Things Considered. These are 3 great programs. So, but wait, before we go too past, I spent a year working on a boat. What kind of boat and where?
I had been here actually. My sister was the dispatcher at the boat basin, and I worked in the office there first summer before I was finished with college. And the summer after that, I thought I might want to come back to Nantucket, but there was a job open on a classic motor yacht out of Newport, Rhode Island for a stewardess. And I was on my way down there to interview for that job, and they hired someone, and they said, "Can you cook?" And I said, well, I can follow recipes. Sure. And they gave me a trial weekend. The guests on the boat were the Conference of Italian American Plastic Surgeons and their wives. I'm not kidding. And we took them up to Providence for a night. And apparently I did the right work because they hired me. And I went all around the East Coast, Block Island, Nantucket, the Vineyard, up to Maine, New Hampshire, Boston, cooking on that boat. It was really cool. It was a 1929 classic motor yacht. It was very, very cool job. To kind of figure out what I wanted to do next.
Having had discovered at UNH that you weren't a veterinarian, but you were a storyteller, like Herriot, and you loved, did traveling on that yacht with all the Italian plastic surgeons spark any short stories or characters or?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But every experience we have as storytellers, puts another book in our proverbial library of human experience. And so everything I've done has gone into the way I pay attention to people and life. And I definitely had a lot of exposure to characters that summer. And that's what we build stories out of, are characters. So I would say that it definitely fed my path, but it also talked me out of wanting to cook for a living. I can tell you that.
And then it's funny though that you would go to broadcast journalism rather than, let's say, to fiction or nonfiction or something like that. So what was the impetus for that, or the inspiration for it?
Well, I thought I might like to make a living.
Oh, well, crass.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I mean, I didn't have an example in my family of someone who'd pursued a creative profession. I had a black sheep uncle who'd been on a few episodes of Jake and the Fat Man back in the day. And his Hollywood stint was bright but brief, and he sort of talked me out of that path. So I thought that studying journalism would be a way to tell stories and support that with something that would contribute to the sum of public knowledge. And also I could possibly support myself doing that.
And you did.
And I have. And on the side, along the way, started to make forays into film. And I'm writing my first play, which is what led to this book, as it were. So I've been able to try and start to build in that more overtly creative direction from the sort of harder edged career of journalism.
But all things considered, and even, I mean, everything you did at NPR, that's storytelling, whether it's about the economy or whether it's about whatever it is, you're telling stories. So, but I know there's a difference between the documentary aspects of some things, but then were you shuttling back and forth between fiction privately on the side while you were?
I've never been interested in fiction. I think it's really hard. I'd like to try it at some point, but I love facts. I love things that actually happened. I love knowing when I'm reading a story that these things happen to real people. There's something about that that just lights me up. So I've never tried fiction. I've been trying my hand for the last few years at poetry, which I love the lawlessness of poetry. To your point, journalism, the constraints of journalism are non-negotiable. Your opinion, you keep your opinions out of it. There's some room for creativity to a point, but you have a job to do. You find out what the two sides are to a story. You accurately represent them so that the listener or reader can make their own mind up about how they feel about the facts. So those constraints got to be a lot. And journalism, I always knew, was a means to some other end. The film industry, I don't have to tell you anything about how hard it is to make a viable living in film. Most who try don't. So I knew that about that industry, and I've been building toward that for a long time. And now it looks like I'm going to be writing in that realm, which I really, really like the idea of.
But the writing that you're doing, is it for documentary feature films?
No, narrative features, but they're all nonfiction.
But they're nonfiction. Okay, so you're making the move toward
Yes.
nonfiction.
Yep.
Nonfiction. So they're not fiction. They're your films that you're inspired to make are based on facts.
Yes.
Okay. I have to say something. This book is kind of amazing. Okay, it's kind of amazing because it rings true. And the thing that I have to say you accomplished in this, as much as, I mean, there's so many things that we could talk about, and I will talk about in the next whatever hour that we have before we have Q&A, right? Is that your prose is poetry. I mean, it's really beautiful the way it flows out of you. So does that come as a gift that you were given, do you think, as a kid? Does it come from reading in bed, your mother or father reading in bed to you as a child? Were you inspired by storytelling? And then did you practice writing, even though it might have been nonfiction and not fiction? Were you writing as a child and in high school and things?
I did, yes. And it's funny, it never occurred to me until, well, just about when I started to work on this, how much writing I had done. I had a mom who really encouraged my creative inclination from a very young age, getting me into youth theater.
Youth theater?
Theater, yep.
Okay, so you were on stage?
I was on stage, yep. And I was always directing my friends and family members, whether they wanted to be in them or not, in plays. I was making films as soon as we got a VHS camera with all kinds of special effects. And I was taking writing courses. My mom had me before high school. I was in a summer writing program with the English teacher at the prep school that I then went to. I was in an essay exchange during the summer working with him. Then I took writing classes all through high school. And then in college, I was doing honors English and I was writing for the school newspaper. And so writing, nothing long form like this, but you know, I took a fiction course in college in addition to all the science stuff I had to take. I was always making room. I took photography, I took acting, all in college.
So there's this creative
streak the whole way, yeah.
impulse in you that was flowing through you like some sort of a river, and you were seeking to find a form for it. And it took many forms, and it's still taking many forms, right? But you were practical enough, and your uncle probably saved you from a life of frustration in Hollywood and New York, to actually channel that creative energy into storytelling for NPR. And so you go to Boston, not far from Concord, right, in New Hampshire, and it's kind of fantastic in Boston, another creative place. But how do you go, for anybody else who might be interested, how do you go from graduate school, studying stuff like that, to actually getting a job at NPR?
I'm very, very grateful to Boston University's Washington journalism program. Anna, you might consider it. They had a thesis semester. Instead of writing a thesis, you could go to Washington and they would hand you an internship. And mine was at Talk of the Nation. Anyone remember Talk of the Nation with Neil Conan?
Yeah, sure.
I was an intern there. And then we also, because I had just done a summer internship with New Hampshire Public Radio, I was reporting for the station all summer long. they said, well, you're good. So we'd like you to be our Washington correspondent. So I spent the third semester of my 3 getting my master's reporting on New Hampshire's congressional delegation from Washington, D.C. and working at NPR's headquarters. So those 2 experiences, I applied for a job at WBUR. It was one of the best NPR stations in the country. They produced 7 national shows at that time.
We get it on Nantucket. It's
Yep.
one of the great things we have here.
Yep. So I got a job there as a weekend morning producer from 4 a.m. to noon, which I wrote newscasts and produced. Those were the most listened to hours of the week because it was weekend edition, Saturday and Sunday, really popular. So I did that. And then I was already from the start, having been at New Hampshire Public Radio, I was pitching to network shows as an intern. And the ladder in NPR is that you go to a member station and you toil away as a reporter for a long time, and then maybe you can start getting your stuff on the network. But I did that from the start, and I thought, well, why would I do that when I can just keep pitching to the shows? So I did. And my editor there, she still is the bureau chief. And
No, you're in Washington or Boston?
in Maine.
In Maine.
She's based in Maine.
Oh.
And she handled all the reporters, the stringers in the New England area. NPR has hubs. And so they have editors, 5 of them around the country, and I would pitch to her. And that actually was really good practice finding stories that had universal resonance, because I was based in a very small place, but I wanted to pitch to the national shows. And that's a sensibility I've always had. I want to tell stories that anyone can recognize themselves in. And so it was training over 20 years of finding stories like that. How can you find a story that maybe is about Maine, but that someone in Nebraska can find something in it for themselves?
Okay. So this is exactly to the point that I felt having gone through this book, which is for sale at the back of the library, thanks to Mitchell's and Bookworks and everybody who works there. I think there's someone going to come. Here's what I felt. I couldn't read every page, I told you, because it got here not a few days ago, whatever, and I've just been busy. But I couldn't put it down because while I have Maine in my blood, it wasn't about Maine. I mean, first it was about Maine, and you write beautifully about Maine. And if anybody here has any Maine in their blood or in their background or their family, if you have an affection for Maine, it will be reflected here and captured in really beautiful prose. But it seems to me, having just heard a little bit about your background, that the way you were writing as a kid, the way you were drawn to nonfiction, the way you were trying to tell stories that had resonance, the way you were dealing with politics in Washington, the way you were, everything you did, without knowing everything, was leading to this book. And you found in this book a really interesting story. And if you don't know what this book is about, let me tell you briefly. Okay, it's about, microcosmically, what happened in Maine for a year during the global pandemic. I mean, let's say that was the umbrella subject, okay? And it crosscuts, and it introduces right away in the first paragraph this fantastic character, the first woman governor ever in the history of Maine, who was elected at the age of 71, and her name is Janet Mills. Middle name? Trafton, a great name, somewhere we could trace that, but Janet Trafton Mills, 71 years old, she becomes governor of Maine, and she gets elected just before the worst thing that's happened in 100 years to Maine happens. That is, she's got a population of 1.6 million people there, and she loves every one of them. She's born in Maine, bred in Maine. Her family's been public servants in Maine for generations. She comes from a really rich and noble tradition of public service. She's highly educated. Most people could be, looking for retirement at that point, but instead, she runs for governor. Now, we'll talk about her, and I want you to tell me about how you met her and all those things. But then it intercuts shortly thereafter, after meeting Janet Mills and in Augusta, the capital, and in her governor's mansion there as the hell breaks loose, with a young woman who's also from Maine, who is the opposite in every possible way from Janet Mills. She is a young woman. Her name is Ashirah. She took her husband's names, which kind of disappointed me, but everything else about her was completely admirable, which is that she grew up in the woods. She was bored, bad student, didn't like school until one day her dad took her on this trip and they hung out with this, was he a rabbi?
No,
He was a camp counselor. He was, what was he?
Describe. He's a naturalist.
A naturalist.
Yeah, he had a Micmac tribal elder had lived in his family's
A Micmac.
backyard.
Wait, that's a tribe in Maine?
In Maine.
Like a Native
Yep.
American. Okay.
Yep, had lived on his parents' farm and taught him from a very young age the traditions, the Micmac traditions. So he was keeping that alive. They call it cultural appropriation today, but he was keeping it alive in Maine, and with that man's permission. And Ashirah and Chris met.
Wait. So she goes to intern with this guy the way
Yeah.
you interned,
Yep,
and she
exactly.
spends a summer with him, and she realizes, oh my God, what this guy is teaching up in the wilds of Maine is how to live off the land, how to appreciate nature, how to become one with the trees and the forest and the birds and the earth and the sky and the rain, how to identify edible plants, how to do all these things intuitively that and it rings her bell the way your bell was rung as a young woman, and it rings this young woman's bell. Her name is Ashirah Knapp, Knapp, after her husband Chris Knapp, and by the way, she meets him because he's also right.
Mhm.
Tell how do they meet? Tell that story.
He was born in Maine and was had been kicking around, also didn't like school, and had just done a really interesting program in Norway where he was learning to build traditional shelters according to ancient traditions in Norway, and had just come back. And this man, Ray, by coincidence, was going to build one of these conical structures and was looking for helpers. And Chris heard about it and went and really liked him and decided to come back to his farm and study with him. And they had Ashirah there living with them.
The young woman and the young guy and the young woman meet, and they work out there in the middle of nowhere on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back to nature kind of concept. And they don't fall in love at first sight. In fact, they're very different. The
They
opposite.
did not fall in love at first sight. It took a while. And she thought he was, sort of against people and didn't want to be in and of the world and resented humanity's impact on the planet. And she thought that was, he's too misanthropic for her. So, and he thought that she was too cautious and careful of her limits and, not adventurous. And so their first impressions of one another were not great. But they spent more time together, and then
they spend how long? I mean, months together.
Months,
right? Working together,
yeah.
with this kind of guru of wilderness living and learning, right? Which is secretly, I mean, what their passion, what's driving them both to be with this guy. And despite their original antipathy, they start to fall in love. And it's a beautiful story how in this amazing environment, they fall in love and get married and decide to
start a homestead. And it's an outdoor living school of their own in the woods in Temple, Maine, which is pretty central west in the middle of nowhere.
They buy 100 acres, 100 acres. And they, in the middle of it, like when the road ends, I love the way you write this. The writing is so beautiful, but like when you can't go any further, you have to go further to find them, because the pavement ends, the numbers ends, you're off the grid, there's no cell phone reception. You keep on going on dirt roads and muddy roads. And just tell them what you find at the end of it.
Oh gosh, I mean, how many people are familiar with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and his Hobbit stories?
Right.
It feels like walking into the Shire. You've left the rest of the world. And you might think that what you're going to find there is people who are avoiding the rest of us. And they're so not like that. What they're trying to do is awaken and support a feeling of that we're all part of our natural world. And to whatever extent you want to incorporate that into your life when you leave, that's what they want to support. And they want to try to teach the skills that if you did want to do what they do, that you might need. They have a family stay program. It's incredible. They have families come with their kids and they stay on the homestead for like 3 days and sleep in this conical earth lodge and get bitten by mosquitoes and pick blueberries. And they have a gap year program that they're trying to make. They're in the process of starting a scholarship for, and that's going to be an official high school gap year accredited year you can take and study on their farm. They've got a college program for that too. So the school is very much about to start to grow and expand and become something more formidable.
But in the early days, we're talking about 2020, as the pandemic hits in March, they're just getting things off the ground. The school is open, but it's nowhere near where it's going now.
Yep.
And what happens is, even in the middle of nowhere of your 100 acres in Temple, Maine, and it's such a great name for the town because it is their temple, they are also affected by the pandemic. Like, you can run, but you can't hide from the pandemic because it's everywhere. Like, should they be having their school for all these kids and these people? And then the governor, Janet Mills, has to do something for them and everybody else in Maine, her constituents, because she understands she's a public servant. It's not about her. It's about how she can help and save them from the worst medical crisis that America has experienced, the world, in 100 years, right? So they have to shut down their school. And tell our audience how Ashirah responds.
Well, would you mind if I read?
There you are.
Okay, so it's a few months into the pandemic. It's May by this point. Do you all remember those first months? We're sort of coming out of lockdown by May for states that had one, and that was most of them. And the Blaine House is, like a lot of places out here, it's a lot like this building, very regal with the black tick chimneys and the belvederes, and there are 28 rooms. And
this is where the governor lives in Augusta, Maine.
She lives in Augusta in the Blaine House. It's in the governor's mansion. And she was a widow when she was elected. So she was literally alone in a 28-room mansion. And she had, except for her security detail, and she had someone who reviewed her mail named Martha Courier. And I'll read you a little bit about Martha. By early May, the governor's office was inundated with mail from both supporters and opponents of the state's pandemic response. Hundreds of letters and cards arrived daily, and the job of managing them belonged to the director of constituent casework, Martha Courier, a Republican who joined the administration after working for then Attorney General Mills. Janet Mills was the first female attorney general in Maine and one of the first women attorney generals in the country.
Am I right to think that she was a Democrat as well?
She's a Democrat, yeah.
But she was centrist Democrat, so she had a Republican.
A Maine Democrat, which, similar to Maine Republicans, are a dying breed, a very moderate, centrist, seeking compromise sort of governor and politician, really career politician. So Martha found herself stopping to read many of the letters because she needed the boost. In the middle of May, she opened an envelope with a return address in Temple, Maine, about 40 miles away, and took out a letter written by hand on 2 pages of lined 3-hole notebook paper. I loved that. The sender's penmanship was small and tight, and so distinctive that Martha read the whole letter, which was now a week old according to its date. Its writer, Ashirah Knapp, explained that she and her husband, Chris, were in their early 40s and had 2 adolescent children. She described their family as homesteaders who ran an outdoor education business teaching resilience living skills. Ashirah also had a part-time job in a medical office, but for now, the family's income was at a 100% standstill for as far ahead as we can see. The Knapps had no debt, but were living on savings, she wrote, through being very thoughtful, and because we provide for a great deal of our needs from our land, including grain, vegetables, eggs, meat, and milk, about 70% of the food they consumed. Nonetheless, their business was among those that cannot open right now. Ashirah added that she was sharing her family's situation because she felt they had a leg to stand on when we say we support you. She wrote that she'd been so grateful throughout to have Governor Mills in office during the pandemic. We've felt a strong and sensible leadership from you, which has been a great comfort and confidence builder. The Knapps had been listening with horror and disappointment to news stories of protests and people and businesses defying laws. We've had a good many discussions with our kids about freedom, choices, social responsibility, and laws. Ashirah felt that there were no easy answers with this one, that no matter what decisions the governor made, people will get sick, people will lose money, and people will get angry. She added, I'm sure your own hopes and dreams for your work have been upturned, just like the rest of ours. In closing her letter, Ashirah lamented both the unprecedented situation the governor was dealt and the unfair criticism being leveled at you right now. She believed that no one in the world knows how to get through this, and there's no way through that does not have anger, fear, and death along it. In the Knapps' small circle of friends and neighbors, there was strong support for the governor's choices, but Ashirah knew that that knowledge can fade quickly in the face of vocal criticism. To counter all the negativity, she promised to send a letter every week until we get through this time, to keep reminding you of the many people who agree with the path you're choosing for our state. Lastly, in closing, she added, please share our thanks with your staff as well. Striking for so many reasons.
So the remarkable inspiration that a woman in the middle of nowhere would have to write a letter of support to a 71-year-old widow governor at the State House. I mean, how many here have ever written a letter to your governor? Like nobody, right? Or your senator or your president or anybody who ever represented you. You just figured they're doing your job. I don't know if I've never done that. It wouldn't even occur to me to do that. But it occurred to this young woman, Ashirah, and she said, I'm going to write to her and just let her know that even from where we are in the middle of nowhere, we're here to support you and thank you for what you're doing, because she felt, I think, something that she had learned by living alone in the woods. And this is what her school was teaching, which is how to live intuitively. Right? One of the things that they were teaching at this school, which I think is why she and her husband, Chris, were so great at teaching, was that nature is the greatest teacher. If you listen. Do you remember at the end of Siddhartha, when Siddhartha, who wants to be the Buddha, is looking for enlightenment, finally gives up all his worldly wealth, he gives it to his servants, he makes love to his mistress one last time, Kamala, in the forest, and he goes to the river, and he finds the ferryman, and he says to the ferryman, can I learn what you learn, what you know? And the ferryman says to the young Buddha, to Prince Siddhartha, what do you mean? Shh? He says, if you want to be with me, just listen to the river. And they get in the boat and they just go back and forth, ferrying people back and forth across the river. And then the young Buddha wants to sleep in the hut with the guy. He says, no, you sleep outside and listen. So anyway, And he listens and listens until, of course, sitting under the Bodhi tree one day, he hears what he's been seeking. I think that Ashirah and Chris were living a similar kind of intuitive life, that they were there listening. Do you feel that way?
Well, I know that they practice that. She calls it inner vision, and she talks about it in the book. Or she talked about it with me in the interview, and I put it in the book because I thought it was relevant. She's so grounded. My sister, who's here and to whom I dedicated this book, met her at one of my events, and I was listening to you had the same observation. Some people think, what's this going to be like? Even Governor Mills asked me that. She's coming out of the woods to do these events with us. What's she like? Is she well-spoken? Is she's so deeply at peace within herself, at her core, and was taught how to cultivate a relationship with her intuition to the point where she could recognize it from, the other urges that we battle as people, our insecurities, our doubts, our fears, to always find a way back to her intuition. So yes, absolutely. I also think that what she did was a stunning act of agency. And I just wrote about this the first time I have ever shared my opinion as a journalist. I just wrote about this for the Boston Globe 2 weeks ago. I believe in the face of the great challenges of our time that too many of us are telling ourselves we don't have the agency to make a difference in the face of any of those challenges. And this woman didn't ever question that. And I remember the first conversation I ever had with her, she asked me why I wanted to write this book, and I told her what I just told you with my very serious NPR face on about agency. And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, I mean, don't you obviously believe in your own consequence as a human? And she said, no, I just was doing the thing that I could do. And I said, that's agency. That's agency. And that's why I want to tell this story. And I knew already how much her letters had affected the governor, because the first time I met, or the second time I met Janet, she had been asked if she got any hate mail during the pandemic. And she said, yes, she had, but that she'd also gotten far more positive correspondence, including from this one woman who'd been writing by hand every week for a year. And then she choked up at the dinner table. And it was stunning, allowed herself a protracted emotional response in front of strangers. And you never see politicians do that. If you do, it's by accident off camera. And here was this woman who collected herself and said, and she just sent me what's going to be her final letter. And I'm really sad because it's been like having a companion through the course of this pandemic. Her letters kept me grounded.
So that's what this book is about. It's about this incredible correspondence and this incredible relationship between these two women there in the middle of Maine, fighting in their own way the greatest battle of this part of the 21st century. And it's so beautifully told because they're polar extremes, and yet they're completely linked. And as you tell the story of the pandemic and their relationship and this incredible thing that this young woman does, which is write to the governor, well, the governor writes back to her, and they begin this correspondence, which is really unusual and quite beautiful and inspiring.
And I believe unprecedented. I did make an effort to try to find out whether any other governor had received any kind of sustained correspondence like this. And the National Governors Association tried to put out an APB for that, and we didn't hear back from anybody. I did some other research. I mean, there are lots of examples of one-offs, someone who wrote to President Lincoln and the letter reached him, and you hear about that. But I don't believe there's ever been a sustained correspondence like this. I would be happy to be wrong about that, because I think it's extraordinary. And I'd like to think there are more people who've done something like this.
I don't want to give too much of the book away because there are a lot of surprises in it and kind of great things, the way that pandemic evolves over the course of this year that they're doing all of this. It's when President Trump is president, and he's clearly against everything that Janet Mills is doing, and he goes to Maine and he wants to open it up, and it's all the politics of that time. And what you do, I have to say, is that you bring it all back. You bring it all back because on some level, I wanted to forget, like what the hell the pandemic was all about, even in Massachusetts. For example, if you were from Massachusetts, you couldn't travel to Maine. You were forbidden to go to Maine. And Janet finally, the governor, Janet Mills, finally opens because the tourism industry in Maine is a massive industry. I think the number is $6.5 billion every year comes from the tourist industry, from even the New England states. But people from New Hampshire and Vermont were not allowed in Maine. People in Massachusetts weren't, or Connecticut, or God hell, if you're from New York, forget about it, right?
Yeah. I have a funny little thing I can.
Oh,
read
yeah,
about that.
please. Yeah.
Quick. A Boston Globe columnist found humor in the restrictions. Quote, "We used to be friends, Maine," he wrote in a spoof column, complaining that Governor Mills had just announced to the entire world that every person in Massachusetts has the cooties. Maine had been letting out-of-state visitors from New Hampshire and Vermont just waltz in the door and eat an overpriced lobster roll like the coronavirus never happened, he quipped, adding that he was, quote, "sure tourists from Massachusetts aren't a central part of your economy or anything." I thought that was a good one.
And they certainly are. That's Trump, criticizing her.
Yeah.
So anyway, what happens is that, you have the election, and I don't want to tell you what happens at the end, because Janet Mills also is being challenged, and in the election, and she has to go up and decide whether or not to run again, and whether or not, and then what she's going to do about the pandemic, and like how that record was going to affect her, and whether or not she's going to win. There's this political suspense that I don't really want to give away about what happens. But there was something beautiful that I remember that Ashirah wrote, because Janet Mills, being educated and a historian and trying to inspire her people, who are forced to wear masks, who are forced to get tested, who have shut down their business, who are losing their jobs. It's Independence Day. It's the 4th of July in Maine that year, whatever it was, 2021. And then she writes a letter, or she gives a radio speech, and she's giving once a week, once a month,
Once a week, weekly radio addresses this governor gives.
like fireside chats
Yeah.
to the people of Maine.
Yep.
And she talks about Frederick Douglass.
Yes, that's right. NPR had done an extraordinary thing. They found descendants of Frederick Douglass and had them read a poem, or sorry, not a poem, a speech that he'd given to, I forget which women's organization it was, but it's an extraordinary presentation. And if you can find it, you should watch it. He basically tells these women, they invited him to speak on Independence Day, and he said, "You're free, but I'm not." And boy, did he let them have it in that address. And so NPR had found his descendants and had them each read a few passages of this. And Ashirah had just been watching it with her kids. That's how they spent Independence Day on the homestead. Really extraordinary.
So the governor, Janet Mills, had found that a descendant of Frederick Douglass, our friend who spoke here on this very stage, Frederick Douglass, the former, if anybody doesn't know who he is, the former slave who wrote, these great books, who is Lincoln's inspiration and good friend, and helped inspire the Emancipation Proclamation. He has a niece now who's like a great niece, but who's 15 years old, and who reads this speech that that Frederick Douglass had given. And Ashirah, in the woods in Maine, streams this for her children and watches a documentary on Douglass, right? And writes about that. So her own children, so there is this feeling. The title of the book is, in other words, leadership. In other words, leadership. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, because it's such an interesting title, but that's.
I'd love to tell you the story of the title.
Please.
One of my favorite stories to tell, and the person in the room is how I got there. I did not have a title, and I had 4 hours left to choose one, and I still have my list of not titles, and I kept going through them, and there are times when you know you have something and times when you know you're close. And I was close. And I remember an editor telling me, if you can't title your piece, you don't know what your piece is about. And I thought, well, I know what it's about, but I need a really good title because I want people to want to read this book and not think that it's going to be reliving a pandemic as a slog. So I called up my sister, who's sitting right here. And as I've done in previous times when I was under the gun, and just said, she just helps me kind of cut through the noise sometimes. And I said, she's on the school board in our hometown. And I said, talk to me about being in that position during the pandemic. At some point in the conversation, we got there, and she told me that, there were parents in the town who would get up at these meetings and rant about how they didn't want their kid wearing a mask. And she said to me that some people just shouldn't make decisions for others. They can't be disinterested. They can't make unpopular decisions because they have their own interests at heart. And, those people should never be leaders. And I said, oh yeah, you mean like, in other words, leadership. And then I went, where have I seen that phrase? Where have I seen that phrase? And I'd like to read you where I saw that phrase. Like this. So thank you, Kelly, for getting me there. Janet wrote back to Ashirah only 4 times during the course of their correspondence. And that's one of the reasons why I asked her for her personal journal entries, because I needed to build out a story. And she gave me, I still can't believe it because they're very candid, unedited excerpts from her private journals that she's kept a journal every day since she was 5. So and she's a sitting governor, by the way, who didn't know whether she was going to be reelected or elected. So she allowed me to print these, which she'd never intended for publication. But the last letter that she wrote to Ashirah after getting Ashirah's final letter goes as follows. I'll take you back into the story. At some point that day, Governor Mills made time to respond to Ashirah's final letter. It feels like the end of an era, she wrote. Vaccines are here, people are back at work, folks are hugging and shaking hands, friends and neighbors are visiting again, and lilacs are in bloom. Janet Mills, by the way, is a poet, only the 2nd published poet in Maine's history to serve as governor. It's very cool, and a couple of her poems are in the book for any poetry lovers out there. And you have written your last weekly letter of support. She reiterated that Ashirah's letters, handwritten, heartfelt, and real, had helped keep her grounded throughout this year. They had also helped her staff remember that families in Maine are dealing with issues every day. Training a new dog, homeschooling children, birthing farm animals in the spring, running a business, going to work, putting one foot in front of the other, doing what has to be done to get by. Ashirah's children would surely remember this time as the year their mother taught them the value of an inquisitive mind, the need for integrity, faith, and hard work, love for neighbors seen and unseen, as well as how to birth a goat kid and how to adore a disruptive dog. In other words, leadership. She thanked Ashirah for her letters and her courage. I hope when our paths cross on Main Street in Farmington, you'll say hello. So the governor used that phrase writing to Ashirah, and I thought, that's the title. There's no more perfect title. It's extraordinary. So that's the story of the title. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, well, no, because to be a leader, well, we know what it is. We know what it isn't, but to lead is to, yeah, well, I don't even have to tell you, but this is what your book is about. But the funny thing is, Ashirah is a leader too, and her husband, or they're leaders, and these women kind of inspire each other. And what you've done, I think, in the book is by telling their story in Maine between these 2 women and how that reverberates in that one state. It brought back for me everything that was going on in my state, Massachusetts, what was going on in New York, what's going on in LA, what was going on in Dubuque and Des Moines and all across the country, and then all across the world, where people were praying really for leadership, because people were dying every day. Your friends, right? millions of people died. Million people died in America.
Almost 7 million people.
7 million people died. So anyway, I think that by telling the truth about your story in your home state about these two women, what you've done is microcosmically tell a global story that anybody could relate to because of the way it resonates in all of our lives. You know, this could be translated into Chinese, and I'm sure the Chinese were looking for leadership.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that was my intention. Truly. I was telling the library staff tonight when I came in that I knew very early as a journalist in this crisis, we were going to have death tolls, and we were going to have definitive numbers of how many people had been tested, infected, and killed. But we were never going to have numbers for all of us to quantify the effects of the sacrifices each of us made in our daily lives. How much loss we might have spared someone by wearing our mask, getting a vaccination despite our own uncertainties about how we felt or didn't feel. All of those things that people did, there was never going to be an accounting of that. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was to give that back to each of us. So I'm thrilled to hear you say it had that universal resonance. It is set in Maine, but that is the world of the story. The story is about leadership, large and small ways that it can affect our lives, truly.
On that note, I would like to open up. I mean, and you did it. I have to congratulate you.
Thank you.
You did it. You did it. We didn't talk before this. I didn't want to know anything about her. I just like met, we shook hands, and I wanted the book to do the talking, you know. But I also would like to have you do some talking. And if you have any questions, I mean, it's time to ask if you have any questions about for Shannon about the work or about anything you can think of. If you're a young writer or a writer yourself and you want to know about that world or anything, I would just say, let's open the floor to any questions.
It's always quiet at first, and then people start to raise their hands.
Sean, do you have any questions? And with Sean, if you do have a question, just raise your hand, and then Sean will bring you the microphone so we can hear your question. Please. Yes. Well, hang on.
Talk with, for instance, Senator Collins, is that? Or
Susan Collins,
some of
yeah.
the other leaders of the state, did they chime in with this project at all? Or?
They did, you know, I asked to speak to Susan Collins for this book because I wanted to talk to her about Janet. They're friends, and they don't always agree with one another's politics, but they do have a close friendship. I think a camaraderie as women, despite their difference in political ideology. But she didn't want to be on record. I think maybe there were a lot of reasons for that. But I read a lot about Susan, and I found in the process of doing the research, I found a remarkable account that she'd given of her experience during January 6th. Very personal. And I included a lot of that in the book. I quoted heavily from her experience of that day. She was the only representative from Maine's delegation who had been in the Capitol at the time of that the insurgency broke out. So from that moment through to the end, when she, and I love this, when she and Lisa Murkowski went back to Senator Murkowski's house where Lisa's husband was waiting with 2 glasses of wine and a fire for the 2 women senators. So I really appreciated her account of that experience, and I included a lot of it in the book as a way of representing her voice. She was in a race for re-election at the same time as all of this was playing out with the then speaker of the majority speaker for the Democrats, Sarah Gideon. And Sarah Gideon ran the single most expensive Senate campaign in US history to try to unseat Susan Collins. So I think that might've been the reason why she didn't really want to comment. But spoiler alert, Sarah lost and Susan won by her slimmest ever margin of victory. So I don't know if that's going to be an easy race for her next time around. But Susan's an interesting counterpoint to Janet, a dying breed as a Maine Republican who does often seek compromise and work with Democrats and make centrist decisions. And that is part of the character of Maine and of Maine's politicians. So yeah, she didn't want to talk to me, but Angus King did talk to me, Senator King, who's a longtime friend of Janet's. And there's a lovely story. Janet actually, the governor called around early in the pandemic when she had to first declare the state of civil emergency to shut down the state. And she called around, and I'll do my best Janet impression because you were there for that story. It's a really funny story, but she called former Governor Brennan. And she said, listen, Governor, I've got to make this decision and it just doesn't feel right shutting down my state. That's not why anybody runs for governor, to close bars and beaches. Did you ever have to declare a state of civil emergency? And Governor Brennan said, well, no, Jan, I never did that. Sorry. And she said, great, thanks. Okay, bye. And then she tried to call Governor Baldacci, and she said he was playing golf in Florida and she couldn't get a hold of him. She didn't want to call her predecessor, Paul LePage, who had called himself Donald Trump before there was Donald Trump. They did not get along. They battled when she was AG and he was governor. He sued her. She didn't want to call Paul. So she called Angus King, who'd been two-term governor of Maine before he was a senator.
An independent.
Independent, one of the only independents in Congress right now. And she said, and they're old friends. So she said, Angus, I got to shut down the state. Did you ever declare a state of civil emergency? And he said, well, yes, Jan. Yes, I did. In 1998, the great ice storm, I shut down the state for 3 whole days. And they didn't know how long this was going to go. So she said, okay. What'd you learn? And he said, well, Jan, you got to get out on the street and let your constituents see you and shake their hands and be out in the public. And she said, Angus, it's a goddamn pandemic. I can't go out in the public. So he said, oh, you're right. Okay, well, then tell the people the truth. Just tell them the truth. Even when you don't know the answer, especially when you don't know the answer, tell them the truth. And she did. She remembered that advice the whole way through. And when I spoke to Angus for this book, he made a really great point that I appreciated. He said, listen, this never before in American politics have politicians who are often future presidential candidates, governors, had to make so long a marathon of politically unpopular choices. And here's Governor Mills doing that with no concern for whether she's going to get reelected or not. It's what's the right thing for the majority of my constituents. And he was really struck by that. And he said, the reason that's so hard as a politician is because say your lockdown or your curfew shuts down someone's bar and they lose their business. They feel that. They lost their business, but they may have saved your mother's life and they'll never know that, like I said before. So those are the decisions that she's making between people's lives and people's livelihoods. And I don't want to spoil it. I mean, well, I'll just spoil it. She was reelected by a historic margin. So note to both parties that pandering to the base isn't always the best way to lead. And I thought that was worth amplifying. So Angus gave me a great interview, and that was the one that ended up including in the book.
I already know the answer, but to this, because it's, let me just say also, this book is annotated like footnotes. You remember how you wrote if you ever had to write a thesis or a paper or anything like that?
So many footnotes.
Went to college. Oh my God, there's like, I don't know, 20 pages.
We put them at the end though, so they won't.
No, they're all at the end. But I mean, I'm just saying, look, those are just the footnotes. So this is a very factual writer. This is a woman who came out of, the highest tradition of, like, let's tell the truth about these situations. And by the way, let's prove it. This is not opinions, right? So another question. Yeah, Sanchez.
Need the microphone, but I am also not sure if it's a question, but it is about your creative process. So at some point you decided to do this project, and everything you did before that led to this project. And now the project is finished and here you are, you bring it into the world. So what do you see happen because of this finished project?
Well, I can tell you that the book tour that I've been on this summer has been immensely fulfilling. People sort of stumble up to the book signing table with this like starved look in their eyes, desperate for a positive story, and they're grateful. They keep looking at me and I don't know what to say back to them. They say, "Thank you so much for writing this book." And they turn to Janet, "Thank you for everything. It's thank you, thank you." And we're sitting there, we're like, you're welcome. Welcome. I don't know what to say. My family members, my friends have said for a long time, why can't the media tell more positive stories? So I've done that. This is a positive story about civility and compassion. I once read a description of Rachel Carson's work that she celebrated what we stood to lose, and that was the greatest form of admonition. And so this book is a celebration of those things. And I don't know, I had an event way up in Northeast Harbor in Maine the other night, and I had 2 ladies come. There were like 6 people on Zoom, and these 2 ladies who came. And so I pulled their chairs in close and I read them the story. And one of them sent me an email at 12:34 a.m. that night and said, "I feel like I just sat in the kitchen with a friend and had an inspiring, this is so inspiring. I'm an old woman and I've been telling myself I can't make a difference in the world because I'm old, but now I'm just going to go out and find some way to give back." So I hope that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah,
I
right.
wrote that op-ed for that reason. I hope that people will contemplate, instead of saying, how could anything I ever do affect positive change? But look, we saw that in the pandemic. One at a time, we stayed off the streets and we saw those pictures of the world's greatest cities with empty streets. And likewise, some of us panic bought toilet paper and we saw the empty shelves. That was every single person making a tiny decision for themselves that had a great big measurable effect. So I can't tell whether that's happening now. I mean, the book needs to make its way out into the world. So please buy a copy and buy a copy for a friend and tell all your friends about it. We're going to do MSNBC sometime. They've rescheduled 3 times, but we're going to do Morning Joe, tentatively scheduled for Thursday of next week, maybe, but they're going to have us on and that will help. So I think the more that people catch on that this isn't, as you said, that this is a story about all of us, and the book starts to make its way out in the world in book clubs are buying it, I'm hearing, I think that maybe we'll start to see a positive, I don't know. I just think we each have to do the best we can in the face of so much division.
You know, yeah. So it's like Johnny Appleseed. You know, you're inspired to tell the story. You tell the story, but then you got to go out and spread those seeds, right? Yeah, sir.
Well, since I'm looking at the flag of Vietnam up here, the example that I'm thinking of comes from Vietnam. When the stores were all shut down and people were having trouble, even the markets, the open air markets were shut down, people were having trouble getting rice. So somebody in Vietnam created a rice ATM. You come up to the ATM, you put in your ID card, out comes a day's portion of rice. So this pandemic that hurt so many people and confused and angered so many people also led to an outpouring of creativity because people said, we have to come up with solutions.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think it catalyzed so much positive change. Things that might have taken 10, 15 years to come about for our society happened overnight. One lovely example, I think there was a lot of skepticism about ballot drop boxes and absentee voting. I believe Maine's voter turnout in the election in 2021 was 85%.
Yeah.
And some extraordinary percentage that I can't reach for off the top of my head, the vast majority were absentee. And so Governor Mills knew she needed to find a way to collect all those ballots. So she put out a quickie bid for, first she called the community college, the guy who ran the community college engineering program, a friend of hers, and said, "Can you design me ballot drop box with a skinny slot, something we can attach to a building?" And he said, yep, 24 hours, he had it for her. And then a barbecue company that made barbecue grills said, we'll do that and we'll take them around the state for you because we have that capability. And they made them. This barbecue company made these ballot drop boxes and now they're still installed for the next election. So much ingenuity and innovation and creativity. And that guy also, by the way, he's the one who early in the pandemic, when there was a ventilator shortage, he designed a ventilator splitter. So you could put 2 people on the same ventilator, the guy in Maine. I love that. A lot of creativity for the better.
By the way, in Vietnam, where I've spent some time, a month, when we were homeschooling our kids, you know, how we call it the Vietnam War, they call it the American War. You know, and the Vietnamese are the most peaceful people. They're all Buddhists, you know, they didn't know what hit them. Oh my God. Anyway, they're so great. If you ever have a chance to go to Vietnam, you might not want to come back. It's like, oh,
Heard that.
it's just so beautiful. Another, hmm?
Really?
Oh God, you know.
Did you serve there?
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They were, yeah. The month we spent there was like joy, right? Yes.
Along the same lines, what's next?
A couple things. I raised a bunch of money a few years ago to hire a professional screenwriter for a project that I stumbled on many years ago, almost 20 years ago. A story set between the world wars about car racing. But at the center of that story is a really interesting friendship between a sort of misfit genius who didn't fit in society, but was trying to push Britain to take on the Germans in taking control of the car industry in the very, very early days. That's the world of the story. The movie is about his friendship with a lesbian heiress who backed him in that endeavor. And so it's about these two people who were too much for the world and the friendship that they built together. So I've just agreed to maybe go and direct that. I'm not sure, but I need to rewrite the script. However, I'd like to write my next book on Margaret Chase Smith, who I see some heads nodding. I learned about her, and Janet knew her. She was held by then Senator Smith.
Can we just say that she's the former
Maybe I'm about
senator?
to. Yeah, she was actually the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. She took over for her husband when he died in office, and that was a tradition at the time. They let the wife serve out the term, and then she was reelected on her own by a resounding margin, and then ran for Senate and won. And in her freshman year in the United States Senate, she gave a 15-minute speech called the Declaration of Conscience. She lined up 6 Republicans, and she was a Republican herself. And she gave a speech that never mentioned Joe McCarthy's name, but was an unceremonious takedown of the way he was raising the nation's temperature with fear and divisive rhetoric and accusations that he was making in the public realm with great charisma, but no proof. Any of that sound familiar? So I've been wondering, what does it take to break that fever? And along comes Margaret Chase Smith's speech. It was a different time. The stakes are different. But I want to write that story, the pas de deux between Joe McCarthy and Margaret Chase Smith. I want to write how who they were, where they came from, how you got one person versus the other. And if things got bad for Margaret after that. I talk about the speech in here, but at one point I can quote what she said. She said, "I do not want to see the Republican Party ride to victory on the 4 horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear."
This is another great woman from Maine.
Pretty relevant. So she gave that speech and then was stripped of her committee roles. And then you had the Rosenbergs, and then you had the beginning of the Cold War, and things did not go well for Margaret for a long time. And then all of a sudden, things started to go really well for Margaret and really badly for Joe McCarthy. So I want to tell that story next. That's, I think, my next book. Do you like that idea? You want to read that? So I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. So the film, when I read your biography, it's talking about film producing as well, and that interests me. And is that the film that you wanted to tell about that?
The Bentley Boys.
The English one.
Yeah.
With the competition with Germany and the relationship with that
Mhm.
woman. And okay, cool.
I was
So-
never supposed to have anything to do with it beyond producing it. And we hired a screenwriter. He wrote 3 drafts. They were about cars. I wanted to tell a story about people. So I said, well, how hard can it be? I'll do it. And we had heard so many takes from writers and they were just all about cars. And so I wrote the script. It took me 3 years to get a draft that my producers who made movies you've seen, that my producer partners said, this is a major movie. We're ready to do this. And I lost one of them. He retired. The other one got a new partner. Long story short, so I'm producing it. I wrote it and I just agreed to co-direct it. So we'll see. But the movie business is on hold at the moment, as you know. Writers and actors, the directors, I don't know, I won't talk about the directors, they copped out, but the writers and the actors, and I think there's a lot of resonance in that, what they're holding out for. It's an issue that if a few people at the top took a little less and the people at the bottom got a little bit more, it would be better for everybody. And that's the message of that strike. So if anyone's like, what's going on in Hollywood and why does it matter for the rest of us? That's why it matters, because that's the universal theme too.
It's certainly about generosity. It's certainly about sharing. It's the profits, but it's also about something else. Let me just say that as an actor, I went, the last thing I shot in New York for my costume fitting. And after my costume fitting, where I was, photographed by the costume department and various wardrobe, they said, please step into the next little room. And I went into this kind of room with black walls and cameras pointing all the way around me. And they said, just stand there and now turn slowly in 360 degrees and say your name, please, and start talking about anything you'd like. And what I understood later that I hadn't understood at the moment is that they were
Scanning you.
digitally scanning me and capturing my voice and my physiognomy so that they could use it anytime later in AI. And what I didn't understand, because nobody understood, that the studios and the networks and the things that we're striking against already were into AI. So if you're going to produce this film and make this film, just protect your actors, protect yourself from all of that, okay? Because then, and then I went and I called my agents, like, what the hell was that? And they said, oh no, at the bottom of the contract, it says, well, you signed, but it also says in the finest print, we own you in perpetuity in all platforms known and unknown throughout the universe. So that's what the strike is also about. Okay.
Which comes back to the earlier point, because they're just trying to make what they make for less money. So yeah, it's we have a lot of big issues to figure out as a global society. We really do. And I think, I don't know, I've gotten a lot out of telling a positive story. And back to answer Sanchez's question, I do think that will trickle out. And so I hope that this book, that you all find this book an uplifting read, and that it goes some way toward repairing what's been torn and broken in our society.
I think on that note,
Thank you very much for coming, all of you, and to the library for hosting us, and to John for his wonderful moderation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Congratulations. Thank you. Well, you just, whatever. You were inspired. But that's what I want. That's what they perfect. Flying gate.
Well, there's hopefully, yes.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
This guy is a wonderful actor.